reviews
I don't care.
on vaccines. Of course, CDC has a safety department, and there are funded sort of safety centers throughout the country.
Okay.
So it's not as if the vaccine community has ignored the issue of vaccine safety.
Well, wonderful. We'll go through all of that, I can assure you. But I got to take it piece by piece, okay? So one step at a time, and we will get to Kaiser and the various things that you just talked about, and we'll address all of them. I just want, hopefully we get to everything. All right. You know what? Why don't we take just a 2-minute quick break?
I'm going to end this.
Perfect.
This ends disc number 3 of the deposition of Dr. Stanley Plotkin. We are going off the record. The time is 14:23. This is the beginning of disc number 4 of the deposition of Dr. Stanley Plotkin. We are on the record. The time is 14:33.
Dr. Plotkin, you earlier said that it would be ethical, you believe, to conduct a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study of the childhood immunization schedule using adults. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, you can't. I suppose you could test the childhood schedule in adults, but it wouldn't make a lot of sense if that's what you mean. You could test individual vaccines, I suppose, although the adults, in all likelihood, will have been either previously vaccinated or previously infected. So it wouldn't be a very easy study to do. But I suppose it's conceivable.
And you think, but it is something that could be done to assess certainly adults are not children, but it would at least give a sense of the safety profile of people who've, on the one hand, gotten the childhood schedule versus those who haven't. And I would think it's something that you would, that you would welcome, given that it should hopefully, I presume, show that both groups will have similar rates of of total health outcomes.
Well, it's difficult to imagine how one would do it. Now, for example, for Haemophilus influenza, disease is rare in adults, of the type B anyway. And so I'm not sure what one would learn by doing such a study. For hepatitis B,
the adverse
of course,
events, not the efficacy, Dr. Plotkin.
Yeah, well, I suppose, but whether it would be translatable from adults to children is uncertain in itself. So I don't think it's a very practical way of studying the safety of vaccines. Fortunately for hepatitis B, it's indicated for adults as well as children, so that's something that can be done. And papillomavirus vaccine, of course, can be given to adults. So we have data from that type of study. But in terms of systematic studies of childhood vaccines in adults, I don't think that's a very feasible or useful.
If the group that received, the adults that received the full schedule versus those that didn't, had significantly higher rates of autoimmune or neurological or other adverse events, you don't think that could provide useful information for potentially addressing potential safety concerns and making the schedule safer? So
for that, you need a group of adults who have never received vaccines.
Why is that?
Well, what are you comparing? If you're comparing those who were vaccinated as children with those who weren't, so you need a group that was not vaccinated.
Well, most adults today have not received anywhere near the number of vaccines that children are being exposed to today. So, for example, Dr. Plotkin, when you were a child, as an example, what vaccines did you receive?
Diphtheria, in childhood, I think it was probably only diphtheria
Okay.
in those days.
So if such a study were constructed, would you be willing to participate?
You mean as someone who did
Yeah.
not receive?
Would you be willing to be part of the study in which you would either, you would be randomized, so you'd either get the saline injections or the full childhood vaccine schedule? Would you be willing to do
Yeah,
that?
but then you'd have
I'm
to
sorry,
have.
I didn't hear the answer. Would you be willing to do that?
Yes, but then you'd have to have a group of 80-year-olds who have received all of the childhood vaccines that are now given,
Okay.
which would be pretty difficult to do. So I think this kind of study you're talking about is either difficult or useless because you don't have the right groups to compare. You could do it perhaps in 20-year-olds, if you could find 20-year-olds who haven't been vaccinated.
Well, if it was, if they did age controls and so they had a range of ages, including 80s and 20-year-olds, would you be willing to participate?
Oh, I'd be willing to participate in
Okay.
any reasonable study,
Great.
but I don't think it would be very useful.
Okay. In 1994, the IOM issued another report regarding vaccine safety. Are you familiar with that report?
94, the
Yeah.
last one was in 2000, as I recall.
2011 was the last one.
Well, okay, there was a large one in about 2000 as well. Anyway, so
In 1994, let me give you. Sounds like you don't remember. Let's just give this to you. Handing you, Dr. Plotkin, what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 20. The title of this report is Adverse Events Associated with Childhood Vaccines, correct?
yes.
This is also by the Institute of Medicine. This is also, in this report, the IOM looked at 54 serious injuries associated with a number of different vaccines, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you provide information to the IOM committee conducting this review?
I don't recall doing that.
Okay. Do you see on, and there are the acknowledgements on the second page? Your name is in the middle there, Stanley A. Plotkin, Pastor Morak. I can't pronounce.
Merrieux.
Yeah. I don't speak French, I apologize. And can you pronounce that?
Merrieux.
That's MEREUX CONNAUGHT company. Okay. Now, if you go to, out of these 54 conditioned pairs, the IOM found sufficient evidence to support a causal relationship for 14 of them and rejected a causal relationship for 4 of them. Do you see that?
Where are you referring?
So if you go, Dr. Plotkin, to the fifth to last page, it has the causality table.
Mm-hmm.
You see category 3 is the evidence favors rejection of a causal relationship.
Yes.
Okay, and you see they rejected it for 4 of the associated adverse events, correct?
Mm-hmm.
You seeing, is that a yes?
Yes.
You see in category 4, it says the evidence favors acceptance of a causal relation.
Yes.
Okay, do you see that there's 2, 3, there are 5 conditions listed there, including Guillain-Barré, bronchial neuritis, anaphylaxis. Do you see that?
Yes.
Okay. And on the next page, for category 5, which is the evidence establishes a causal relation, do you see that it lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 conditions, correct?
Yes.
Okay. However, for the remaining conditions, so they looked at 54. If we subtract out the 3 categories we just looked at, 38 of those conditions, the 38 remaining conditions, the IOM couldn't make a causality determination because the science hadn't been conducted yet, right?
Yes.
Okay. The IOM stated at the end of this report, quote, the lack of adequate data regarding many of the adverse events under study was of major concern to the committee. Presentations at public meetings indicated that many parents and physicians share this concern. Do you see the last page of the report that you're holding, of the excerpts? Do you see that it says that in the first 2 lines under need for research and surveillance?
Yes.
Dr. Plotkin, in 2011, the IOM then issued another report on vaccine safety, and this time it looked at 158 of the most commonly claimed serious injuries after vaccination, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. The title of that report is Adverse Effects of Vaccines, Evidence of Causality.
Yes.
You're familiar with that report?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know who commissioned and paid for that report, by the way?
Which commission?
Who commissioned and paid for that report?
No.
Okay. Would it be surprising to you if I told you that HRSA, the agency within the HHS that defends against vaccine injury claims, that commissioned that report?
Wouldn't surprise me.
Okay. Did you provide information to the IOM committee conducting this review?
I don't recall specifically whether I did or not. A lot of people ask for my opinions, and when asked, I give my opinions.
Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's been marked as Exhibit 21. Is this the 2011 IOM report we were just talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Do you see there's little Roman numeral 7? Page little Roman numeral 7. See a section entitled Reviewers?
Oh, yes. I'm on the list.
Okay. Do you see, I'm going to read the first 2 sentences and you can tell me if that's what this report says. It says, this report has been reviewed in draft form by individuals chosen for their diverse perspective and technical expertise in accordance with procedures approved by the National Research Council's Report Review Committee. The purpose of this independent review is to provide candid and critical comments that will assist the institutions in making its published report as sound as possible and to ensure that the report meets institutional standards for objectivity, evidence, and responsiveness to the study charge. Is that what it says?
Yes.
And you're one of the people they gave the report to you to review?
Yes.
And next to your name, it says University of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
It doesn't disclose that at that time you were working for all 4 of the major vaccine makers, correct?
What do you mean by working for them? I mean, at that point, I was no longer at Pasteur Media Connaught.
Did you, in 2011, were you receiving compensation and remuneration from Sanofi?
I was, yes, as I've said before, I was consulting for Sanofi as well as others.
Were you consulting for Merck?
Yes, probably at that
and,
time, yes.
And GSK?
Yes,
Okay. And as well as a whole host of other for-profit companies seeking to develop vaccines, correct?
yes.
But I'm just saying that's not mentioned here, correct?
No.
Okay. So, do you know how many other individuals who were involved in reviewing or compiling this report were receiving money from pharmaceutical companies making vaccines that's not disclosed in this report?
I have no knowledge of that.
You provided handwritten comments to the IOM for this report?
If I reviewed the report, which apparently I did, I am sure I made comments. I don't know if they were handwritten, probably not, since my handwriting is illegible.
In this report, the IOM found that 14 of the 158 serious injuries most commonly reported after certain vaccines were that the evidence supported a causal relationship, correct?
Is that, where is that stated?
Well, if you go to page 3 of the report, it's numeral there. Well, let me ask you the question a different way, Dr. Plotkin. If you look at that chart, you can see that there's little symbols. Do you see those, Dr. Plotkin?
Yes.
Okay. So an I represents inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship, correct?
Yes.
And an FR means favors rejection of a causal relationship, correct?
Yes, apparently, yes.
If you look through this,
No, FA favors acceptance.
I said FR, I'm sorry. FR favors rejection.
Right.
FA favors acceptance. And CS is convincingly supports a causal relationship,
Yes.
right? So I think what you'll note when you look through this chart is that most of the conditions have an I, correct?
Yes.
Any reason the report indicates that for 135 out of the 158 reviewed, it found that it could not locate sufficient evidence to make a causality determination, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the IOM concluded that of the 135 most commonly claimed injuries from vaccination, it didn't know whether or not the vaccines caused that. Let me ask you something. You know, you earlier stated that hepatitis B doesn't cause encephalitis, right?
That's my opinion, yes.
But the IOM, after doing its review, determined it couldn't find science to support a causal determination one way or another. Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
But that means that they don't have evidence for the supposition.
That it
Right.
either causes or doesn't cause.
Right.
They don't know.
They don't know because there aren't enough data.
Right. But you have, but
In the absence of data, my conclusion is that there's no proof that causation exists.
so if there's no data to show that it causes or it doesn't cause,
Yes.
your supposition is that I understand correctly?
Yes.
Is that it doesn't cause it.
That there's no proof that it does.
Okay, that's different than saying it doesn't cause it, correct?
Correct.
So when you were saying earlier when I asked you at the beginning of this whether certain vaccines cause certain conditions and you said no they don't, Did you just mean that no, there's not enough evidence to make a decision one way or another?
I mean that there's no knowledge known to me that they do certain things that are some may have alleged happen after vaccination.
Like, for example, the IOM reviewed whether hepatitis B can cause lupus because of lots of reports, or influenza can cause lupus. They concluded that there's insufficient evidence one way or another to make a determination. You indicated, but you indicated earlier that those vaccines don't cause lupus. Your testimony, you're saying that you said no because you weren't aware of a mechanism by which it could cause it. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. But the science really isn't available to make a determination on causation yet, right?
The science doesn't show that there is a relationship. And it is, unfortunately, to prove a negative requires a lot more data than to prove a positive.
If there was a study that had a placebo and a control group, then we could know whether or not these conditions are caused by these vaccines, correct?
Yes, it would have to be an enormous study, and it would have to be randomized, ideally, which is unlikely to be the case since...
It needs to be the enormous because you're assuming these conditions are rare, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And this study that you're saying needs to be done before vaccines are licensed, they do clinical trials, we've seen, right?
Yes.
And they have thousands of people typically in them, correct?
Yes, and
Okay.
therefore they can study common conditions. But uncommon conditions are very difficult to study because they are uncommon. And therefore one would need a very, very large study, and one would have to have randomization, which is, of course, inherently difficult.
If you actually had a placebo-controlled study, an inert placebo-controlled study of 8,000 people, you could at least determine that in a population of that size, whether or not there is a detectable adverse event rate for any of these conditions, correct?
For some of those conditions, yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to show you. I'd like to show you an excerpt from that report. Okay. Before I do that, actually, a few quick little questions. Tdap is one of the vaccines on the childhood schedule, right?
Yes.
It's administered to babies during the first year of life.
Yes.
We already talked about this at 2, 4, and 6 months, right?
Yes.
Okay. Did I say Tdap or DTaP?
Oh, DTaP is the one that's used.
I meant DTaP in that question.
I have Tdap.
Okay. Same answer if it was DTaP, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so let's correct that, please. Now, as for Tdap, TDAP, little d, little a, little p, with a capital T, that's given to pregnant women, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And DTaP and Tdap refer to vaccines which contain diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, and acellular pertussis, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What was the IOM's conclusion in 2011 about whether these vaccines can cause autism?
I'd have to look that up, but I feel confident that they do not cause autism.
You feel confident that that's what the IOM concluded?
I don't remember what the IOM concluded, but I don't believe there's any evidence that that's the case.
Is there any evidence that that's not the case? Why don't I show you this, Dr. Plotkin? I'm going to hand you what's being marked as Exhibit 22. Oh, Dr. Plotkin, may I actually have that back for a moment? I'm sorry. Nope, I gave you the right one. There you go. Thank you. Okay. This is an excerpt from the IOM's report, right?
Yes.
Okay. And this is where the IOM discusses the evidence with regard to whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism, correct?
Correct.
Okay. If you turn to the second page, can you read the causality conclusion with regard to whether DTaP and TDAP cause autism?
The committee did not identify literature reporting clinical, diagnostic, or experimental evidence of autism after the administration of vaccines containing diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, and acellular pertussis antigens.
Okay. Dr. Plotkin, I'm sorry. Can you please read, Dr. Plotkin, can you please read the causality conclusion with regard to that the IOM reached with one second, Dr. Plotkin, I'm sorry. The court reporter has got to be able to take down the full question or there won't be a clear record. Can you please read the causality conclusion in the IOM report with regard to whether DTaP and TDAP can cause autism?
The evidence is inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between diphtheria toxoid, tetanus toxoid, or acellular pertussis containing vaccine and autism.
So the IOM reviewed the available evidence with regard to whether TDAP or DTaP can cause autism, and their conclusion was the evidence doesn't exist to show whether DTaP or TDAP do or do not cause autism, correct?
Yes, but the point is that there are no studies showing that it does cause autism, except one study by two well-known anti-vaccination figures, Geyer and Geyer, who have no legitimacy whatsoever. So what they're saying is that there's no evidence, and the important point from my point of view is that there is no positive evidence to do a proper study, as we've been discussing, which would disprove it, would involve the controlled administration of vaccines and withholding vaccines from children who should have them.
Dr. Plotkin, was the IOM able to identify a single study that supported your claim? Strike that. If you take a look at that section, please, was the IOM able to identify a single study supporting that DTaP or TDAP do not cause autism?
No, they did not identify a study.
Okay.
But the point is, and I have to repeat myself, that absence of evidence does not allow you to conclude that the two phenomena are related.
You're making assumptions, Dr. Plotkin, about, I think, what's built. I understand that. I mean, I only interrupt because, it's 3 o'clock and I don't mind letting you, give a lot of discussion about things that aren't relevant, but to the question.
I think it's relevant in the reports issued by the IOM.
Yes.
That their conclusion about evidence not being available does not allow you to conclude that the phenomena, that there is a causal relationship.
I'm not sure. No, I never said that, and I'm not sure anybody in this room said that, Dr. Plotkin.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
But it does allow you to conclude that the evidence doesn't exist to say that DTaP and TDAP do not cause autism, correct?
There is not evidence to say a million different things.
Okay.
You have to prove.
Did the IOM report look at whether the MMR vaccine can cause autism?
I'd have to look and see.
Yes.
I believe that they did.
And what did it find? Found? I'm sorry. They said it did.
I'm looking to see.
It said it favors rejection. because it did find studies,
Yes,
correct?
yes,
That's right. So studies are possible to determine whether or not a vaccine does or does not cause autism, correct?
they are possible, yes.
Okay. But the study to determine whether DTaP or TDAP does not cause autism has not been done, right?
A study that would definitively show that it doesn't has not been done, but there's no evidence that it does.
Okay. But since, Dr. Plotkin, we don't know whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism, right? It would be a bit premature to make the unequivocal sweeping statement that vaccines do not cause autism, correct?
In the absence of evidence, one should not draw any conclusions except that there is no evidence. And so I don't infer from the absence of evidence about a million different things that they're necessarily true. One has to do studies to determine whether or not a phenomenon exists. And usually those studies are done because there is some suspicion that of a relationship. But we have no suspicions, at least I don't, that autism is caused by DTaP.
Well, you may not have that suspicion, but it is one of the most commonly reported conditions, adverse events, which is why it was reviewed in this IOM report from DTaP, TDAP, which we discussed earlier. So I'm not asking you to say that vaccines do cause autism. I'm not asking that at all. I'm asking you as a scientist, can you make the statement that vaccines do not cause autism if you don't know whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism?
As a scientist, I would say that I do not have evidence one way or the other.
Right.
As a practicing physician, I have to weigh all kinds of things in making a decision about a patient, whether to do something or not to do something. And I make those decisions based on the body of knowledge, even in the absence of definitive information for every case. This has been true for medicine ever since its inception.
I'm asking you a simple question. I'm asking you, since the science has not yet been done regarding whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism, isn't it true that you cannot make the sweeping statement that vaccines do not cause autism?
I could make the statement that there is no evidence that vaccines cause autism.
Okay.
And therefore,
I'm not asking you that
and
question.
Therefore,
Dr. Plotkin,
and therefore,
yeah.
vaccines,
Time to move on.
and
He's not
therefore,
answering the question.
and therefore, vaccines should be given to protect against serious diseases.
Dr. Plotkin, if we've already reviewed the IOM report, the IOM could not find evidence that DTaP or TDAP cause autism. I'm asking you, knowing that, isn't it just a bit premature to make the unequivocal sweeping statement that vaccines do not cause autism?
I would say it is logically true that you cannot you cannot point to proof that it doesn't cause autism. But as physicians and public health specialists, one has to make decisions in the absence of thousands of pieces of information that one would like to have. And one of them is that vaccines protect against serious infectious diseases, and there's no evidence that they cause autism. So therefore, I recommend vaccinations to this child and every other child who does not have a contraindication.
But since there's no evidence that DTaP or TDAP don't cause autism, you can't yet say that vaccines do not cause autism, correct?
I cannot say that as a scientist or a logician, but I can say as a physician that no, they do not cause autism. Because as a physician, I have to take the whole body of scientific information into consideration when I make a recommendation for a child.
Their IOM reviewed the science. They didn't find a single study that supported whether or not vaccines.
Forgive me, counsel, your connection's not that great. It's very choppy, and I cannot hear anything you're saying, but I do hear your voice. Please repeat.
All right, at this point, Dr. Plotkin, just wait for him to move on to the next question.
I'm not asking the same question, Counselor. Your objection is noted. I'm responding to his comments, which are different every time. So, okay, so what you're saying is, as a physician or logician, then you couldn't say vaccines do not, you could not say vaccines do not cause autism. But as a pediatrician, you're saying that you would say that to a parent because you want to make sure they get the vaccine, is that right?
You know, I can't be sure that DTaP doesn't cause leprosy. That doesn't mean that that stops me from using a DTaP vaccine.
Are people claiming that DTaP has caused leprosy? Are you aware of any such complaints?
I'm not aware of any such complaints, but I wouldn't be surprised to see it on the web one of these days.
Okay, but people have made enough complaints about DTaP, TDAP causing autism that the Institute of Medicine at the commission of HHS thought it was serious enough to do a scientific review, correct?
Yes.
Okay. They didn't review whether DTaP causes leprosy, did they?
No.
Okay. So, and after conducting that review, they found that there was no evidence at all that they could find whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism. I'm just asking you a simple question, which is, since there's no evidence that whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism, isn't it a little premature to say, to make the sweeping statement that vaccines do not cause autism?
No, I do not agree with that, because absence of evidence works both ways. There's no evidence that they do, and the ideal study has not been done. I agree with that, but in the absence of any reasonable evidence that they do, I continue to recommend their use.
Okay. So you're willing to make a statement that a vaccine does not cause a condition, even in the absence of any evidence?
I'm willing to state that there is no evidence that the vaccine causes the condition, and there is a lot of evidence that they do protect against disease, and therefore the child should receive the vaccines. I mean, there are a million things on the web, including all kinds of diet advice based on ridiculous information. So why should I adopt that?
Are you saying that the IOM was engaging in a ridiculous review here?
They were doing a scientific review, which is certainly legitimate, and their conclusion that there are insufficient data to draw a formal conclusion. I can understand that and appreciate that, but that does not mean that the vaccines cause autism.
You've never been asked that. The only thing I've asked you is whether or not one can assert that vaccines do not cause autism.
Counselor,
not that they do.
Let's be real. You're asking me these questions because you want me to legitimize a view that vaccines cause autism, and I will not do that, because absence of evidence is no proof whatsoever.
I think that record is very clear, Dr. Plotkin. I'm not trying to legitimize anything. I'm just asking you to. I'm not trying to legitimize that vaccines cause autism. I think
I'm glad to hear that.
we have very clearly established what the IOM found. The IOM found, in their estimation, no evidence. Right?
Right.
They found no evidence that vaccines do cause that. That DTaP or TDAP cause autism. Let's make that very clear, right?
Right.
They found no evidence
Right.
that DTaP or TDAP cause autism.
Yes.
Period. They found one study which they said was unreliable because it relied on VAERS data and it had no control, right?
Right.
Okay. But similarly, in the same vein, they also didn't find any evidence that DTaP, TDAP do not cause autism. Now that doesn't mean that DTaP, TDAP do cause autism, correct?
Correct.
It doesn't mean that, right?
Yes.
That's right. All it means is that they couldn't find a study that showed that supported that it does not cause autism, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that's why they reached the conclusion that they did, which is they said the data is insufficient, right? I assume you said, was that a yes?
Yes.
All right. Do you agree with the IOM's conclusion that the data, the evidence is insufficient to determine whether or not TDAP, DTaP cause autism?
I agree with their conclusion, but that doesn't mean that I don't act on other information.
Okay. I can understand that. But I'm not saying that I'm not asking you to ignore any benefits you believe accrue from vaccines. Okay? I'm not asking you to do that at all, Dr. Plotkin. I'm simply asking you as a pure matter of logic, and common sense, if you don't know whether A causes something, can you say A, B, let me not use a hypothetical. If you don't know whether DTaP or TDAP cause autism, shouldn't you wait until you do know, until you have the science to support it, to then say that vaccines do not cause autism?
Do I wait? No, I do not wait, because I have to take into account the health of the child.
And so for that reason, you're okay with telling the parent that DTaP, TDAP does not cause autism, even though the science isn't there yet to support that claim?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm also willing to tell them it doesn't cause leprosy.
Okay. Again, did the IOM review whether DTaP causes leprosy?
No.
Okay. All right. Dr. Plotkin, has there ever been a study which looked at the total health outcomes of children following the CDC's vaccination schedule and those who are completely unvaccinated, such as Faith?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't think so. But you know, there are all kinds of studies. There's a study that suggests that children who are vaccinated compared to unvaccinated children have lower rates of leukemia. Now, do I believe that study? I find it interesting, but I would want confirmation of that study before I believed it. But just to point out that Peter Abbey, for example, as I mentioned before, found that measles vaccination had a positive effect on health and reduced mortality. I think there is abundant evidence that vaccines do contribute to the health of children. But in answer to your question, there is no study that I know of that compared the health of vaccinated children with unvaccinated children.
Why has that study not been done?
Probably because it is considered bad malpractice not to vaccinate a child.
So you're saying a prospective study might be improper because it will leave a child unvaccinated?
Correct.
Okay. What about a retrospective study?
That, I suppose, could be done, but it wouldn't be randomized.
When I say retrospective, that means using existing data, correct?
Using children.
Why don't I ask you, strike that. Can you define retrospective, please?
I mean, looking at children who had been vaccinated and comparing them to children who had not been vaccinated.
Okay. Presumably, HMOs, insurance companies would have health data on enough vaccinated and unvaccinated children to conduct such a comparison, correct?
Well, I don't know, because the percentage of unvaccinated children, fortunately, is quite low. So I'm not sure how easy it would be to do that study. And I would suspect that many of those unvaccinated children are not in registers that could be used.
You're familiar with the Vaccine Safety Data Link?
Yes.
Are you aware that there are a few thousand children that are, are you aware that there are reports from the government reports that show that there are a few thousand children that are, my understanding, completely unvaccinated in the VSD?
Oh, I don't doubt it.
Okay. Couldn't the Vaccine Safety Data Link be used to conduct a retrospective vaccinated versus unvaccinated study to look for health outcomes?
Well, I don't know. Theoretically, perhaps, but one would have to be convinced that the children were comparable in other ways besides being vaccinated or unvaccinated.
Okay. Every time you do a retrospective study, that you always need to control for potential co-founders, correct?
Correct.
And that's what you're talking about, controlling for co-founders, right?
Yes.
And you know, if you're doing a case control, properly matching cases, or if you're right, are you saying that? So I mean, the CDC, pharma, they conduct studies all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Including studies.
Yes.
Yes, including studies that have co-founders that need to be controlled for, right?
Yes. They
Vaccines?
try. Yes.
Vaccine studies, especially for efficacy, happen all the time, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, again, if the data is there, why not do a study comparing vaccinated to completely unvaccinated children to look for the total health outcomes, so you know what the real risks are from vaccine, or get at least a sense of what the real risks are for from vaccinations?
Well, I can't completely answer that question. I'm sure it would be a difficult study to do, but I will repeat what I said earlier about measles vaccination. I would just remind you again that among those children who were not
You've already
vaccinated,
said all this, Dr. Plotkin. It's
yeah,
fine.
well, I'm going to repeat
I've got
it.
it. But
There were three deaths and 24 cases of encephalitis,
Okay.
and that's unbearable.
I'm sorry. Can you read back what Dr. Plotkin just said?
We were talking over each other.
I apologize.
Well, I can't completely answer that question. I'm sure it would be a difficult study to do, but I will repeat what I said earlier about measles vaccination. I'll just remind you again that among these children who were not dashed, you've already said all this, Dr. Plotkin. I got it. Answer, well, I'll repeat it. 3 deaths and 24 cases of encephalitis. That's unbearable.
Okay.
Excuse me. My plug is stuck under there. Give me 2 seconds again.
Take your time. Is that a problem? Okay. No, it's all right. Dr. Plotkin, who prepared the notes that are in front of you?
Me.
Okay, when did you prepare those?
Oh, about a week ago, I guess.
Okay. During the break, our lunch break, did you talk with anybody?
No. Well, yes, I talked with my wife.
Anybody else?
No.
Okay. So I understand that you find injuries that can result from what you've called, I believe, vaccine preventable diseases. What we're trying to do is understand the risks of vaccinating, and in particular for faith. And can you appreciate that? Understand. Strike that. So you just think it's too difficult to look at, to do a study comparing vaccinated and unvaccinated children, even though the data exists to do that. Is that right?
Well, I simply am saying that I don't know how feasible it is. I've never been asked to look at it before, but I do think a priori that it would be difficult because those children are very likely from different socioeconomic groups and different racial groups, and so it will be a difficult study to do. I don't know if it's feasible or not.
Uh-huh. So with all of the government, so the pharmaceutical industry, you said, made approximately $20 billion last year in revenue from vaccine sales?
I think so. I don't.
Okay. I have
yeah.
the financial statements.
Mm-hmm.
Should we review them, or do you think 20 billion is about right?
I think it's about right. I'm not an accountant. I don't
Give or take
read those.
give or take $1 billion or $2 billion, would you say?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
So the pharmaceutical industry has had $20 billion in revenue, and the CDC spends hundreds of millions of dollars buying vaccines every year. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay. But yet you don't think that the resources can be done to do a single solitary study comparing the health outcomes of a for-profit product given to almost every child in this country to assess what the rate of adverse reactions are between those who get all those products and those who don't?
What I said is I simply don't know whether such a study is feasible or not, but I think it would be difficult to do because it would not be a randomized study, and therefore the conclusions might be questionable. But I don't know whether such a study is feasible or not.
Aren't most studies that are done that you rely upon in that book that you have in front of you not randomized?
Many of them are not. Many of them are.
Okay. Do you throw out the ones that are not randomized?
No, it depends on what the purpose of the study is. Mm-hmm. If it's studying immune responses, it doesn't necessarily have to have a control group.
Dr. Plotkin, I'm going to hand you what's being marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit 23. Whoops, I'm sorry. Dr. Plotkin, what's an ICD-9 code?
Well, it's essentially a way of coding diseases usually for remuneration purposes.
Okay. So when a doctor administers a drug or diagnoses as a patient or something similar, there's a code that they would enter into the system, right?
Yes.
And the ICD-9 codes are published by the American Medical Association, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Please take a look at the exhibit I just handed you is the 2015 ICD-9 CM Professional Edition for Physicians Code Book, correct?
Yes. Mhm.
Or at least the front page in one excerpt, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So if you go to the second page, do you see there's a code V64.07?
Yes.
What is that code for?
Vaccination not carried out for religious reasons.
Okay. So wouldn't it be feasible, for example, to compare children who have this coding, who are not being vaccinated, with those who are being vaccinated, who are in similar communities, have similar demographics, and otherwise avoid as much as possible other potential co-founders?
Well, if you could eliminate the co-founders, it would be feasible.
And what are the co-founders, Dr. Plotkin?
Well, as I said before, the co-founders include a socioeconomic level, racial grouping, exposure to agents. In other words, are they living in a community where it's unlikely that someone unvaccinated from Ethiopia is going to come into the community and be able to transmit diseases? There are, I'd have to sit down and write up a list of possible co-founders, but there would be many of them.
So when you do studies for efficacy, are you able to control for all of these co-founders?
Well, usually the effort is to include as many different types of individuals as possible, so that if there is a problem with a particular group, you can identify it. But doing clinical studies is not always easy, and that's why the conclusions from clinical studies have to be seen in relation to other clinical studies.
Why is it you can control for co-founders in various other vaccine studies, including in vaccine safety studies that are cited in your book, but you believe you? Are you saying you couldn't control for these same co-founders in the study of a vaccinated versus unvaccinated population?
I am unable to draw a conclusion about whether such a study is feasible. What I'm pointing out is that the likelihood of there being multiple co-founders confounders, is very high, and therefore it wouldn't be an easy study to do. That's all I can say. I've never sat down to try to figure out how to do such a study.
Okay, well, we've got socioeconomic, which are probably pretty easy to control for, racial grouping, pretty easy to control for, exposure to agents. Since it's retrospective, you'll know if there's been an outbreak in a community. What other co-founders do you think might exist? I'd like to hear one that can you tell me a co-founder that's not easy to control for?
In principle, one can control for any confounding problem. The issue would be just how many there are and just how large a group you would need for statistical significance. See, that's another issue. We accept as a valid conclusion something that is false 5 times out of 100. And so not only do we have to try to eliminate confounders, but we also need repetition of studies to be sure that the results we got in the first study were not in the 5 studies that were false in their conclusion. So you would need multiple studies.
Okay. And since these are retrospective, they're really just running data, right?
If the data are encoded, yes.
Okay. So I asked earlier, what co-founder can you list that's not easy to control for? And I did not hear another co-founder. Can you tell me a co-founder in this proposed study that would not be easy to control for?
Exposure would be probably the most difficult. In other words, whether a child is living in a community where exposure to disease is rare or absent, or